Okay, it's recording.
All right. So hello, everyone. Today we're talking about finding free images online and legally using them in your course, your Sakai course and other course materials. With us today is Dana Knott from the library.
Hi,
and
everyone.
she'll be sharing her presentation with us, and I'm going to pin her video so that you can all see her, if that works. And Dana, take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, so today I'm basically going to limit my focus on finding free images online. However, I think, in the future, it would be a good idea to also offer another workshop on videos and music and sounds and all that good stuff. But if you have any questions at any point, please let me know. I do want to mention that I am not providing an exhaustive list, but just highlighting some of the big ones that pop up. The PowerPoint slides will be available, and the sites that I've mentioned are linked in that as well. But please, at any point, let me know if you have any questions, and Bonnie will be monitoring the chat.
And we'll be recording a list of all of these items on a page in the Academic Technology Teaching with Technology site so that you don't have to write them all down.
All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about images and copyright. So anytime you snap a picture with your camera, or you create a work of art, or you design a piece of architecture, it immediately falls under copyright, regardless of whether or not you have registered it under a copyright office or a license. So those are some things to keep in mind. For example, if we look at images on Facebook or social media, if you see some of those images, you would need to ask people permission for that as well. So one thing with copyright, sometimes it can be very frustrating as an educator to find and connect to really great resources that you come across that you want to add into Sakai or some of your course materials. So one thing when we think about copyright, it's kind of this delicate balance. Primarily, copyright wants to acknowledge the intellectual property of the original creators, but at the same time, you do want to consider public need when it comes to using these kind of images. So let's talk about what happens when I create something. So as a creator, maybe of a photograph or a drawing, I'm granted specific exclusive rights in regard to what I can do with my image and what other people can do with my image or work. So in this case, I have the right to reproduce and copy my original work. I can create additional works based on that original work, something that's derivative. I can sell it, distribute it, lease it, you name it. And then I have the right to publicly display the work. So all these rights are exclusive to me as the creator. And this is outlined in our federal copyright law. However, there are some exceptions, and I'll talk about those for a moment, but I just want to highlight something that's really obvious in some ways. When we are searching for images online, just of course, basic things we want to look for. Does the image have a watermark? We can think of many times with, you might have a stock image like Shutterstock and things like that. And I mention that because oftentimes students don't pay attention to copyright and may include an image that has a watermark. So these are other things that you want to convey to your students, especially if you are requiring them to give a presentation or upload a project that includes images that they have located perhaps through an internet search. Is there a copyright symbol? Does the image have a copyright notice that specifically has a note that says, hey, this item falls under copyright, and it attributes the owner of that copyright as well. So pass that on to your students, because I see these kind of things pop up as well. So let's talk a little bit about fair use. And fair use comes in with that balance of protecting the intellectual property of the creator, but also being mindful that works can serve an educational purpose or something that people can learn from. And what we usually have is kind of a four-factor kind of litmus test to figure out if something is fair use. And this is a test that applies to really any type of work under copyright. So that could be a journal article, a chapter from a book, a photograph, a work of art. So when we look at the first consideration, what is the purpose of the use? We tend to have a little bit more freedom when it is a nonfiction work as well. Two, what is the nature of the work? This is also fascinating with, when you think about it too, is that are there authors who have put theirs out in the public domain as well? Is it educational? What is the substantiality? Now this one has to do more with how much, the amount. So typically we think of how much of a book can I copy, right? And still have it be considered fair use. And then number four, what is the effect of the use on the potential market? Am I having a great effect on the owner of the copyright's ability to make some money on their original work? So if I'm charging like $300 for a textbook, and then I have someone who uploads that textbook and provides it to students, that will have an impact on it. So always kind of think about this as well. So what gets kind of tricky is that, let's say if I find an image and it is under copyright, however, it might be a historical image, it might be educational, I'm using maybe a low resolution picture of the image. Sometimes there's some freedom and leeway if something is low res versus high res. So the difficulty is whether or not you are repeatedly using an image. So that kind of puts fair use under more scrutiny. You are pretty safe if you take an image and use it for a course or a semester or a limited period of time. But the issue occurs if you have kind of permanently archived photographs in your course. And so a lot of times you got to think about, how long am I going to be using this? Time does have an impact on fair use. And that's my cat meowing in the background, right? So sorry about that. So let's talk a little bit about fair use and free use. Now, fair use relates to anything that is under copyright. So, and it's kind of that, nice little educational law that says, okay, if I'm using it for a non-commercial purpose, right? But then there are also free use images out there. And a lot of those tend not to be under copyright, or they might have a different type of license that grants a user certain permissions. For example, we'll talk a little bit about Creative Commons license. Open access is very similar. A lot of times there's an overlap between a Creative Commons license and open access. And sometimes you'll have a little debate about that too. You'll have some journals that might be open access, some images, educational materials, such as OERs. And then we have public domain, and we'll talk about that in a moment too. One thing, if we think about royalty-free images, those relate more to, I might pay a certain amount of money, a fee, in order to use an image for a certain amount of time, or I might have the owner say, hey, this is royalty free, I'm going to let you go ahead and use it without paying a fee. So you have different layers of that. So let's talk a little bit about Creative Commons. And Creative Commons licensing has kind of 4 conditions that it will outline to users. And this is something very helpful if you are ever creating your own course materials and you would like to share, but at the same time, highlight your intellectual property. You can actually visit the Creative Commons site and go through the process of licensing your work and deciding what kind of permissions you want to give. But the 4 conditions relate to attribution, where you have to identify the original creator. And I do want to mention that when you find an image, especially one under copyright, attributing the original owner or the creator doesn't take away your responsibility to kind of follow copyright. So it's not enough for me to take an image and say, hey, I got this from so-and-so, or I have a website. So we still have to think about different factors with fair use and permissions. The next condition would be share alike. How am I letting people use my work? Is it okay if I give permission for someone to copy it, download it, maybe even make changes to it, edit it, so modification. So I can decide, all right, how much I want to go with that. And then I can decide what kind of use. Will I allow it non-commercial use, meaning, not for profit or educational institutions? Or am I happy and fine with people using my image for commercial purposes? And then here we have no derivatives. And that means that I would not be able to take the work as a user and modify it in any ways. We can think of different instances where this has happened. I always think of the Obama portrait and then how that was modified by an artist. So those are some things to think about. And once you figure out what kind of permissions you want to give, there are 6 specific Creative Commons licenses. And you can see again that it kind of goes to order how strict you want to be about your image's use. So in this case, if I just had attribution, I'm only saying, hey, you can really, just let me know. Let people know that I'm the creator. And then share alike, I'm giving freedoms where people can modify, copy, download, distribute, things like that. And then 3, I don't want people to make any derivative works based on mine. And then of course the non-commercial versus commercial. And so we can think of all these different things that we have to consider. And so if I just click briefly on the website here, if my internet will load, or Creative Commons will load. There we go. You can see that there is a lot of nice background information about the conditions, license types, and here are some of the symbols that are often used. And so these are things that, again, you want to pay attention to when you're searching for images. Okay, does this copyright symbol allow me to do certain things? So we can think about that as well. So when we get to public domain, these are works that are no longer protected by copyright, intellectual property laws. We can often think of that as works that existed before 1925. Sometimes the copyright will expire on a work. Sometimes the owner or the estate did not renew the copyright. Or you might even have a creator who has designated the work public domain. So we can think about that as well. One big controversy I always think about is the song Happy Birthday, and how a lot of times in films you never really heard that song because a company believed that they owned the copyright, and later on it found out that the work wasn't under copyright. And so you have these kind of interesting things. Public domain can be interesting as well when it comes to architectural work and even photographs of buildings and design. And this is a law that any buildings that were created pre-1990, December 1st, 1990, are not under kind of a copyright. They can be considered public domain, especially if you're taking pictures of a building pre-1990. And let me give an example of that. Of course, we can think of the Eiffel Tower, and that is a building, a structure, a design that's in the public domain. And I can take a picture of the Eiffel Tower. However, I can only take that picture in the daytime because the Eiffel Tower illuminated at night is under copyright, because it's seen as kind of a work of art with the added lights. So even if that building is out and I'm standing on public property, taking a picture of it illuminated, I could be breaking some copyright there. So sometimes you have kind of these strange kind of exceptions to that pop up. So let's talk a little bit more about that. I always like to mention Google, and you can think of other search engines such as Bing, Yahoo, you name it. And one thing that we can always pay attention to is that if we click on Google Images, and let's think of something safe. Maybe I'll just do kittens. So here we have all these wonderful fluffers here. And anytime we're doing a search, we can think about different ways that I can look at my search settings as well. And I think they just changed that. Let me pull that up. I clicked on the wrong one. But there's an ability when I click on tools, usage rights. So in this case, depending on what kind of use I want, maybe I just want to limit to non-commercial reuse. If I wanted to modify it, maybe add it to like a card design with a bunch of hearts around the kitty, I can do that as well. So using search engines can help you identify works that allow you to use them. And other search engines like Bing and Yahoo, they do allow you to filter results by permissions and license to use. One other thing I want to mention with the Google image search is that sometimes if you come across an image, one maybe that had been shared around the internet, and you're kind of interested in seeing where the image came from, you can also do a reverse image search by clicking on the camera. And you can put the URL of the image, or you can upload an image. Sometimes this is an interesting activity to have students do if they are looking at whether or not something was Photoshopped or edited, things like that. So they can also upload. So that's just another tool that we can use. And then I do want to mention, you have some projects as well, such as Google Arts and Culture. And again, you can put those images in, or names in it. And I think I clicked on the wrong link. So we'll go back to that one. So there are so many different image sites out there. This is only a handful. I probably have a list about 40 sites as well, but these are some of the big ones. Pixabay, this is one that, let me go ahead and click on that. You can see that you can get free images and royalty-free stock. I do want to mention that it does have kind of some short video images in there and as well. So you have photos, illustrations, and vectors. And we're just going to limit focus on that. One thing I do want to mention, Pixabay has pretty much licensing similar to what you would see to Creative Commons licensing. And so in this case, for example, I'll just type in flowers. You'll notice at the top, and I like to point this out, is that they do have paid images, Shutterstock, and that's more for them to just make additional money to support their images. But basically, these images come from just community members and those who work for Pixabay. And if I click on something, like the little birdies here, I can see the Pixabay license, free for commercial use and no attribution required. And so you can see the artist listed up above, and you can do little donations if you wanted to, just to show appreciation. And then I can download it. One thing with Pixabay, if you do not have an account, it will just have you go through CAPTCHA just to make sure you're not a robot or things like that. But you don't need to create an account if you don't want to. Other ones would be like Morgfile, and this is a site, again, where users have uploaded pictures that are in either the public domain or they have granted permission for anyone to use them for whatever purpose. Some other ones like public domain pics. And again, I think my links are working weird because they worked earlier. So PDPix is also one where you can search for different images, Unsplash, and different companies are starting to have image search sites too, like Shopify has Burst, Unsplash is another one. So let's talk a little bit about Commons, and I'm sure that you've heard of some of these too. Now, Creative Commons, in addition to its licensing, it also gives you the ability to search for materials that have a Creative Commons license that grants you use of those images. Wikimedia Common, and a lot of times you'll see those pictures appearing in Wikipedia encyclopedia entries, and you can use those. But keep in mind, sometimes users who upload images to Wikimedia Commons, you have to make sure, okay, do they have the right to upload these images? And then Flickr, how many people use Flickr? Well, if you are a photographer or a photography student, or you just want to share different images with your users, you can upload pictures and then decide what kind of use rights you want to grant. Flickr has conveniently created what they call the Commons, and that's an area where you can search for images that grant you the permission to use them. Now, if you're just randomly going through Flickr looking at images, you'll see that the permissions right below the photograph or image, and they'll tell you if, okay, I have to attribute this work. Oh, I can modify this work. Or it's all rights reserved, I'm not allowed to use it at all. So always pay attention to the language that these images are using. Museums are a wonderful resource of images. And some museums are a little bit more friendly in granting permission to use their artwork than others. One of those is one of my favorite museums. I grew up in the Chicago area, so the Art Institute of Chicago, Cleveland, J. Paul Getty Museum, the Met, our National Gallery of Art, and of course, different Smithsonian institutions can grant me access to. Other things, libraries, many of which might have a digital collection, and they've followed initiatives where they have digitized a lot of material. The New York Public Library is a big leader in providing access to many different types of images, especially those that kind of show our past history and popular culture. Now, our Library of Congress has a lot of different images that are available, especially in some of their memory collections. But I do want to note some of those images might still fall under copyright. So even if you're accessing some of these through Library of Congress, depending on where they got the images, sometimes you might have to ask for permissions or you might not be able to use it. The British Library is also a museum that has been pretty generous in providing access. What they have done is actually partnered with Flickr and added so many images just to Flickr's Commons. And then you have the Digital Public Library of America. And this is one site that has conveniently put a lot of these digital archives together so you can get access to a wide variety of images. Academic institutions. So a big one we can think of like Duke's digital collections. So maybe if I am doing a class on images of men and women in advertising, Duke has a really nice section on past ads and campaigns, and I can download those images. There's some really fascinating ones about Lysol and women that kind of make you like, whoa. And other institutions like Calisphere, we can think of California and how there are different institutions in California that have kind of joined forces to allow people access to the images that they have. University of Michigan is also a big one that while they have a lot of free images, some of them are under copyright, but they do have a process where you can fill out a form and see about permissions. So for example, I was once assisting someone who was teaching a history of medicine class, and there are these wonderful paintings of different physicians through history. And oddly enough, University of Michigan owned the copyright of that. And they granted use in the classroom and in slides for 5 years with the opportunity to renew. But the main thing I really want to say is that even if something is under copyright and you're like, wow, this would really work great for my class, and I know that I want to use it more than 1 or 2 times in my class, it's okay to ask for permission. Bonnie and I have actually done this together. Bonnie had an instructor who wanted to use this editorial drawing that made a really powerful point about people with differences and disabilities as well, and equity. And so she and I were able to contact the creator, and he just went ahead and said, hey, go ahead, put it in the course. This is how I want you to attribute it, and you're free to use it whenever for educational purposes. There was another time when I had someone in anthropology who had come across some pictures taken by an anthropologist researcher, and I found this guy's email, and I emailed him, and he said, yeah, go ahead, just put my name at the bottom of it. So you can always ask. Sometimes it works out just fine. I would be remiss in not mentioning that with images, we have to think about, making them accessible. Anytime you're using an image in your course, be sure to provide alternative text. Bonnie and many of you teaching online might have worked with Patty, one of our instructional designers. They can definitely help you with that process of alt text. And so it's something that when a person isn't a reader, then it will pop up for them. Whereas people who don't have vision concerns or issues, they can just scroll past that. But we want to make sure that everyone's having a very similar educational experience in a class, especially if these images are linked to your content. So that brings me to an appropriate description. You have to think about students with low vision, that it's adding extra work to them for their reader to kind of read really lengthy descriptions, especially when you're dealing with complex images. So you want to make sure that you're being concise, but you are also conveying the right amount of information to give them a vivid idea of the purpose of that image. So other things you can think about then is, one, am I giving enough detail and description? Am I being concise? Can I say things in a clearer way? But if it's just kind of a background picture, you can just acknowledge that too. But there are wonderful people in disability support services. Karen Chris, I always like to shout her out because I ask her all the time, like, hey, does this work? Is this accessible? And we are so lucky that we have a wonderful team of people to support us, but then also make sure that we're thinking of all students. So let me pause for a moment and ask if there are any questions from anyone.
I have muted people's mics, but please feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question. There are no outstanding questions in the chat, but someone asked a good one, which was, what is a watermark?
So a watermark is basically just kind of a little symbol that they put over the image just to show that, hey, you didn't pay to use it. A lot of times they will release the watermark if you license it or pay a fee. So one thing that I can bring up again, let me close my PowerPoint for a moment. And so if I go back to Pixabay here, and a lot of you have probably come across the number of paid sites out there, like Shutterstock. And so if I click on a Shutterstock image, you can see that it has the Shutterstock watermark on it. And so sometimes I can tell that if a student had copied just an image, I mean, you can still copy and use it, right? But this will tell me that the person did not get the proper approval, because then once you pay to use it, and sometimes payment can be as little as $1, but if you're looking at Getty Images, they might want you to pay like $500 to use an image, which is not great. I'm actually using Canva for today's presentation, and Canva is just a nice place where you can create PowerPoints, you name it, a lot of handouts, social media posts, and they do connect you to free images, but then they also have images that have the Canva watermark that I would have to pay for to use. Yeah, so you don't want Shutterstock or any watermarks on your images, because that tells me that you didn't get permission. And you'll notice that on other images and materials you come across. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's very clear. And Canva, what they really offer that's different than other places is not just the ability to create these things, but they offer many, many templates, beautiful templates that you can use for your slideshows, your presentations, and I believe you can download them and use them in Google Slides and PowerPoint
Oh,
and
yeah.
Word and all those things. So what they really offer is some great design help if you
Mhm.
just want to download something that's well designed and put your own text and images in it.
Yeah, and I'm not a designer. And so the images that I have in my presentation today, those allow me just to use them without attribution. And so I don't have to link them. I don't have to credit whoever created them. And I can edit them if I wanted to as well. And so sometimes when we think about use, programs like Canva, and you can look at Pixabay, they have some really nice high quality images, but other places might grant you permission for low resolution images. And if you wanted a higher resolution image, you'd have to pay for that. And that's another way that they can kind of control how their images are being used, because we tend to prefer things that are higher resolution. And just another kind of thing that you can pay if you wanted a higher quality image. But most of the time, the low res image for our purposes will be just fine. Any other questions? And so this is just a short list as well, and I'll be putting these also in a guide for you.
Impart some kind of gift for
Oh,
someone.
I'm starting to
That
have
Sorry.
body
appropriate
knows, okay,
amnesia.
that's a resource.
I'm sorry, I didn't, was that you,
No.
Jonathan?
That was my fault.
Oh,
I was unmuting some people so they could chat, but I got background noise.
is there anyone else?
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording and then we can have a little informal discussion if anybody else wants to chime in. So thank you all for coming.